Today, the latest from Joe Wilkes in New Zealand. Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Welcome to our latest post covering finance and property news with a distinctively Australian and New Zealand perspective. Hello Joe, good to see you again. Happy Christmas.
And to you, yeah, nice few days off. A bit of rain on Christmas Day. Other than that, it's been delightful. So we've managed to get a bit of sunshine.
I wanted to discuss today the question of planning, because it seems to me that there is a significant question here which is both relevant to New Zealand and Australia. So in Australia, as I discussed recently with Edwin Almeida, we've had the issue of the Opal Tower at Olympic Park. And essentially, people now have been evacuated from that 35 or 34-storey building, depending on who you listen to, because of the cracks appearing on the 10th floor. But Edwin's point is that there is probably more here than just a few superficial cracks. It could be something reasonably substantial to do with the foundations, the fact that we've had significant change in the climate over the last little while, from a lot of dry weather and then a lot of wet weather and now dry weather again, and other factors. So it begs the question of who's responsible for planning, how does planning work, and where are those decisions actually taken and who takes responsibility for them? So Joe, what's the story in New Zealand?
Yeah, I mean, my trip to Auckland, I think for me was a real eye opener, and I was only filming for a day and a half by the time I got there, and I was astonished by the quality of some of the construction that's going up. The materials, they seem that they're almost like materials that you used to see in the former Soviet Union. Big concrete panels, whatever's put in between them was. I don't know. It's questionable. It's questionable how well they'll stand up if there is an event. And New Zealand is a country it is prone to earthquakes. And if there was an earthquake, I don't know. I mean, I'm always a bit sort of mindful of the building industry because profits are what drives building, and sometimes there is that tendency to cut down and be. I suppose a little bit cheap on the products that you're using to make sure the end all profit comes out the other end. When I was in the UK, we saw questionable building. In fact, there was one house I remember selling, and it had been signed off by the building control. I don't know how it got signed off, but I got a phone call 2 days later from an owner when his wife had gone for a bath on the top floor in what was the second floor of the building, and the bath had gone through the floor and ended up in the bedroom below. So. I'm not saying that that's going to happen in multiple constructions, but there were some really worrying signs of what I would call very cheap materials being used. The quality of the timber framing that you see, particularly on the one-off buildings, the standalone units, there didn't seem to be enough timber framing to support the size of buildings you've got. And I don't know how some of these are getting through planning. We've got lots of these unregulated sites going up around New Zealand, and Auckland is an area where there's a huge amount of building going on. I mean, anyone who has the audacity to say that there is a shortage of property, from what I saw, they're talking out of their arse, Martin, because there are thousands of empty houses all over Auckland, and it's made me sort of very fearful of the narrative that New Zealanders are being told in the press. Little things that just seem to get swept under the carpet. I read in a financial website a couple of days ago that the figures for Q3 GDP, which is June to September quarter in New Zealand, the figures are quite slow in getting released. So you think end of September's the 30th. You've had pretty much 2.5 months since then for the figures for the last quarter to be released. And these are really important things. I was a businessman for many years in the UK, responsible for 100 people on my payroll. And I had to make decisions based on, okay, what's the economy doing? How's sentiment? What have we seen in the last quarter? And it was really important to get that from your financial papers, from the news, so that you could plan your business, make sure you have a responsibility as an employer to make sure that your business is there in 5 years, 10 years time, and the people who are themselves reliant on your good decision making to have the incomes that pay their own mortgages, that you're informed as a business leader. we've not seen anything in the newspapers about GDP, which has come in significantly under forecast, Martin. It's the third quarter was 0.3% growth on anticipation of growth between 0.5 and 0.6% for that quarter. So that's quite a long way short. And I don't think people really understand that that shortfall actually impacts the government's tax take, how much the government therefore has to spend on infrastructure, how much the government has to go and provide increases in pay for nurses, for doctors, for teachers, firemen, the like, and police force. So if we're coming in under budget, and this is something that it was announced 4 or 5 days before Christmas, and it has been seen nowhere, not in any of the major newspapers, hasn't been in the Herald, hasn't been in stuff. And as a business owner, you need to be able to understand these things. There seems to have been a small drop off in consumer spending over the quarter, but a larger part of it, and it's not a surprise from what I saw around Auckland, has been in the construction sector of the economy, and we've got an economy that is so heavily reliant on property. With, I mentioned it in one of the Auckland posts, 58% of lending by banks is to mortgages. And then a third of the remaining 42% is to the construction sector. So, over 70%, 71, 72% of lending is to this one basket of our economy. We can maybe cover in the future the level of indebtedness that we have in our farming sector, which seems to be quite pronounced among certain parts of the farming market. There are a number of farms that are family run and owned and haven't had debt for a number of years, and where the families have been, they've been building their businesses without taking on bank lending. But there's actually a huge portion of the farming industry for which we're very, very reliant on, which is loaded with debt. Fonterra, they've got debt in excess of 8 billion. They're selling assets at the moment, and I don't think that this gets particularly well reported in the mainstream media, because these things they do have an impact when, 6 to 12 months down the line, people are saying, well, hang on a minute, how's all this happened? Well, these are things that actually as a business you can prepare for if you have an understanding of what's going on in the wider market beyond your little thing that you're dealing with.
So do the local authorities in New Zealand have responsibility for planning, or is it done privately? And how's the certification done locally?
There are supposed to be checks and measures made at each stage. I'm presuming by private certifiers. I don't think the government planning authorities have the resources to monitor what has happened, or they can't have been monitoring what's happened. There was one site that I think you'll show in a post that will probably run before this one, where I drove around a whole site of empty plots. Well over 50% of them had been sold. The plots were tiny. The road was in. You couldn't turn your car in the road. And if you wanted to park your car off-road, it means you wouldn't have had any space for a house. But these have been allowed to happen. And this is where I think we need a change of thought. We've let landowners decide, okay, well, we're going to put a very crap road in. We're going to put a couple of parking spaces either side of the road. We're going to section off these tiny plots. And because they're the ones putting in the infrastructure and controlling it, they're not providing adequate resources for how this development's going to look in the minute that anyone builds anything. How much land banking has gone in New Zealand, I don't know, but I would be. I'm actually a bit scared, having been up to Auckland, about how much finance has gone back into remortgaging the family home to go and buy a parcel of land on the expectation it's going to go up a bit, because some of these sites they're nowhere near even starting anything. There seems to be a real mix of construction projects. You've got some that I think are probably generally quite well run. They seem to be developed in stages. The Hobsonville Point site, which I thought was crowded as a development, and it was really interesting for me just how many houses there are still under construction. They've got hundreds and hundreds of houses that are being built. They've got a lot of those houses that are new and are on the market already, but they're actually competing already with the 1 or 2 year houses in the development that people are trying to flip, and there don't seem to be enough buyers for things. It explains why the whole the block thing was filmed in that area. They're trying to raise the exposure. They've got some auctions going on and people paying 7-figure numbers for fairly inadequate townhouses. But but it was obviously something that somebody somewhere has ticked some boxes with the broadcasters and said, well, look, come and focus on this development. That, however, was largely a development that I'd say looked reasonably well built. There were some developments that I saw. There's another one actually within 2 or 3 k's of the Hobsonville site, which was sections of land. I've spoken to a couple of agents since doing the wanders around, and these sections, which are they're just about big enough to get a 4-bedroom house on, but they aren't big enough to provide anything other than a fence 2 meters off the rear of the plot. And these sections were bought for between 600,000 and 700,000. A lot of it was foreign money that bought them. Now, I don't know whether that is foreign debt, which has been raised in China, India, UK, wherever it might have been, and has been used to go and invest. Is this something that we're going to see a knock on with the issues in the Chinese economy at the moment? They've got hundreds of thousands of empty homes in China, and I've read stories of developers who, having sold half a development for high figures, unable to sell the second half, they're discounted by 25-30%. And you've got owners of the original units up in arms about, okay, hang on a minute, you've completely undermined my investment. What we've got in Auckland seems to have been large parcels of these land banks which have been sold off. They have been developed willy-nilly all over the place. How much general regulation is going into the actual monitoring of the materials that are going into the core of the building? I'm not talking about the aesthetic of the outside, but into the core of the building. Is the concrete being checked? Are the foundations being looked at? Are we really checking? Because most of it is timber frame construction. Are we checking that the adequate insulation is being put in? And are we double checking when they put the cladding on that the insulation's still there? And I asked that question because this week we've had a big thing in the news, and one of our commentators said that Auckland's a fantastic place. It's got wonderful beaches. That's why it's expensive. We've got 12 beaches in Auckland that are currently out of bounds for people swimming in them because they're being contaminated by human feces, which is as a result of poor drainage being put in to these developments that are sitting on the edge of the waterfront. There's one in the North Shore. There's several on the west of Auckland. And so 12 of our wonderful beaches are currently in the summer holiday period out of action because the drainage hasn't been monitored by whoever's done these developments. And this is the problem. They're not being monitored. They're not being regulated. And I'd be surprised. I mean, I genuinely, some of the houses that I saw last weekend, Martin, I would compare. Well, I went to Rio a few years ago, and some of the favelas will last longer than these houses will. I genuinely don't know if they'll last the length of a mortgage.
In fact, I was talking to somebody just today who was telling me that some of the investment property developers in Sydney have deliberately constructed portfolios of investment properties without any amenities. And the reason for that is that those amenities cost extra money, and from an economic perspective, they're not prepared to make that extra investment. So they're just focusing on maximising the return from the properties.
Yeah, well, I encountered this in the UK, and it happened a lot after the financial crisis. There was a big movement towards the redevelopment of commercial buildings to residential. Large parts of the high street had shut down after the crisis, and the high streets still are going through a big period of change. And what happened was that some of these larger warehouses, offices, and buildings that had previously been used for commercial purposes were given very relaxed opportunities to change themselves into residential use. And quite often what you found was, I remember some of them in a town called Luton, which is just north of London, 30 minutes north of London, where there were buildings that were former government buildings, 20-story buildings, where these properties were allowed to be converted into 1 and 2 bedroom flats. And on one side, they had over 120 flats with just 25 parking spaces, which you were allowed to buy if you were lucky enough if you were able to go and find another £25,000 to do it. Everybody else, there was no parking. If anyone ever had a visitor, there was no parking nearby. But it's the wrong type of thing to be doing. Now those buildings ultimately ended up being bought back by the council. So the developer has gone and developed the site, turned something that was office space into residential and substandard residential. That the council then, because they couldn't be sold in the normal market, because buyers were looking at them saying, I just don't want to live there. I'm spending money. I don't want to live in them. And what ended up happening was they ended up being bought by the councils, going back into social housing developments. It's not the right way to form a social housing community. It didn't happen in the 1950s post-war. And even in New Zealand post-war, the social housing developments, people were given the opportunity to have a house, a bit of garden, somewhere to park a car, even in the 1950s when fewer people had them. We're just not thinking about what is going to build communities, what's going to keep people feeling happy about their lives and motivated and wanting to progress. There's a big argument, oh, these people don't deserve to live in nice houses, can't afford to buy them. But you and I know that that's just purely because we've got a neoliberal credit bubble which has been allowed to perpetuate for 40 years.
And that's really the point, isn't it, Joe? That if you think about planning, it's all about the individual plot and what's on the plot, but there's very little thinking about the amenities, the local community, the fact that people have to have somewhere to go beyond the property as well.
I think in New Zealand in particular, we've completely lost. We haven't lost the plot. There are hundreds of thousands of plots, but we have lost the plot with respect to planning. And what seems to happen is that somebody who owns a parcel of land, they get permission from the council to say, okay, you can turn it into residential. They then hive it off and make it untenable, really, for a developer to purchase the land at a price that they could do it properly. What almost needs to happen is if you're having infrastructure put in, if you're having a major road put in, and like you have in the UK, they'll make compulsory purchases of the land. The land then is owned by the government for a brief period of time, but that's where this is where the infrastructure is going to go. This is what we need. Some of the developments that are going up in and around Auckland are miles and miles away from the nearest school, from the nearest shops. There isn't even, there might be a coffee shop if you're lucky. There's no pubs. There's no general community. And when you're driving around new development sites and there's nobody there. So this is over the weekend when people aren't at work, they're at their houses. If I was driving around there on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, when everybody's off at work, okay, fair enough. But I think people said, oh, they're all out enjoying the sunshine. Wasn't that nice a weekend? But nobody was around. And I think that we have a bigger problem than really we understand. And I don't think that at the moment, the government are being honest with the people. I don't think the government have been keeping an eye on what's been going on in terms of the regulation, and that's whether it's 10 years old or 20 years old. We've enjoyed the big credit growth, GDP going up. GDP goes up by 3% last year. Borrowing as a percentage of household debt went up by 12 billion, which is about 6% increase in the household debt burden. We've now got household debt standing at pretty much 92% of GDP. The GDP and the debt, the debt is the GDP isn't keeping up with the debt, and it doesn't look like it is now. And we need these stories to be out there, so that not just me, who I go out digging for it and trying to find information, but so people who are running our businesses, running the things that are important to our economy, which is the export industry, the guys who are producing things that can be sold to the world, can make proper business decisions to make sure that we see through what. If you look at the bigger picture, the global picture, looks like it's going to be a rocky time for the next few years. I mean, we mentioned we did the island post a month or so ago, and I couldn't help but drive around Auckland, and we've been to Tauranga, we've been to Palmerston North. Palmerston North, we discovered that people are flipping their houses really quickly. So a large portion of the market, they only own it for a couple of years and then they're back on the market. Tauranga, there's swathes of open countryside that are being developed. Auckland, it's enormous. The city centre, there's a huge amount of construction going on, and questionable construction. I'm not sure whether we're building the right things there, and I would really like to see a proper. get the chartered surveyors involved throughout the building process so that they're there. It's got to be signed off, and it can't be private led, all of it. So these things need to be monitored, because we don't want an Olympic Park situation.
So there really is no central control.
It seems to be, we've got local planning authorities who are handling individual sites and boroughs, but there is no overall view of it. We've got everybody talking about this housing shortage that we've got, and that's been in the narrative of New Zealand for 4 or 5 years. We don't have enough houses. Okay, well, we are still importing people, and people talk about, it's population growth that drives house prices, and we know it's not. But as a result, what's happened is that each local authority said, "Great, off we go." I mean, I live down nearer to Wellington, and we've got some areas that they're building funny townhouses an hour out of Wellington, just off a main road. What we saw in Cambridge and on the outskirts of Hastings, there's huge parcels of land that are being developed now. Is it joined up writing? Has that development happened all because Auckland's expensive, we look good value, off we go, we'll build a few thousand houses? Auckland, I can't see Auckland being as expensive as it is going forward, because there's so much stock out there, and there's so much to come, that we are going to see a change. And to what extent will it be, I don't know, but I can't see anything other than a significant housing correction now.
So this is about maximising the return on properties, isn't it?
Yeah, but it's got lost, and I think it's been lost in Australia and New Zealand primarily because I'm going to be controversial. I'm going to say the banks control our media. The media is not critically analysing anything. I'm getting people in touch with me saying thanks for doing what you're doing, and it's sort of a hobby for me that's escalated a bit quickly since we met in November. But the media aren't questioning. That these are people who are getting paid to do a job. And there's no critical analysis going on. It's spoon fed whatever they're told, and it gets put into print. So we need the message to be spread. I'd encourage our readers to pass over the posts on New Zealand around their friends and family. We are on the cusp of something that is changing. GDP growth has shrunk. We'll find out what happens. Unfortunately, we won't find out what's happened up to the 31st of December until the end of March. So where will we be come September next year? I don't know, but the signs are there at the moment that things seem to be slowing down. You need to make sensible decisions. If you're a first-time buyer, there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of houses all over the country that you can buy them today if you want to, or you can sit down and just take a bit of time thinking about it and maybe being a bit more critical about what you've been told. The banks are already trying to offer unnatural incentives. I saw this in the UK. So we had prices falling. It was very evident that there weren't enough buyers with the capital to buy in, and as a result, what you saw was the shared equity schemes, where you go in and you take on a mortgage for 75%, and the developer keeps their 25% equity, and it's almost like they're completely protected because they've sold the house for a high price. They're taking a bit off the books. Any potential uplift in the price, they will share the 25% benefit of. Any potential downside, you lose. They'll keep their 25% original purchase equity. We're going to see that over here. In fact, one of the banks, and I won't name the bank, people can go and find it out. Do be critical, go and have a little look for stuff yourself. One of the banks over here is now talking about themselves offering a shared equity opportunity for people to borrow at current prices. They will maintain their share in it. And create a bit more money to prop it all up. So seen this already in Australia several years ago. We haven't quite seen it to the same extent. A lot of first home buyers are being encouraged to raid their pension funds. So the KiwiSaver that came in 10 or 11 years ago, which was sacrosanct. It's for your retirement. Here you go. You know, you're building up your nest egg. Your employer's contributing to it. The government's allowing you a bit of a tax break. And many people have built up a good pot. That's now right. That's your deposit. Off you go. So that's one thing. And I've spoken recently to a number of people who are older than I am. I'm not a spring chicken, but I'm not too old. Who within 15 years of retirement have been encouraged to go and use their KiwiSaver for a house deposit to keep their mortgage down or to improve their loan to value ratio. It's great at the moment, but you've still got to retire. You've still got to live on something later. And the general thought on things, it's just cuckoo. I always like to think of the banks almost self-funding themselves. So you put your KiwiSaver into their account. They'll use that to invest in stock shares or whatever. A lot of people have seen their KiwiSavers drop off 15% since October when the stock market's gone a bit wobbly. That actually affects your borrowing ability. So if you had 55 grand in your KiwiSaver and that's now 45, which is about 15%. That could affect your borrowing ability from being able to borrow 7 times household income with your 45 deposit as opposed to your 55. It can be massive. So everything at the moment is being engineered to take advantage of the young, and that's why I'm doing this, because I don't think it's right.
So the key point you're making, Joe, is that there needs to be a broader context within which planning works. So that effectively, when we lay out an area, we think about the broader amenities, we think about the way that the community is going to develop over time. You can't just look at it from a short-term perspective in terms of the value created. So that shows that we need to be thinking more laterally and more broadly about the whole question of the way that planning works.
Indeed. Thanks, Martin. Take care.
Thank you, Joe. Very important message there. Planning really is important, and we have to change the way we think about it. I'm Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.